Hello.
Hi, everyone.
Kayla Lords.
John Brownstone.
Of Living BDSM, where we help Kingsters like you have happy, healthy power exchange relationships. We're back for our final Kinky Book Club video of 2021.
Yeah.
And a little spoiler, it's probably our final Kinky Book Club video. We'll talk more about that at the end. But we read a really good book this month.
Yeah.
Fiction. So, straight up front, let's put it this way. There will be a spoiler-free section. And then if you're like, I want to read that book and I don't want to know what happens, we will warn you when there is the spoiler zone, because if I don't talk about that ending, I might burst. So this month we read, it's SFSX Safe Sex Volume 1 Protection by Tina Horn. It's a graphic novel, so of course there's lots of artwork. And it's Tula Lote, Michael Dowling, and Jen Hickman. It is fiction. It is basically about a world in the not too distant future where the evangelicals of the United States and the porn is bad, sex work is bad, anything outside of vanilla, mostly heteronormative sex, those feminists, they join the evangelicals and decide to take over the world, but they're starting with the U.S., and they basically outlaw anything that's not about procreation and very vanilla, and this is the world we live in, and there's a lot going on.
Yes.
And the artwork is beautiful. For somebody who doesn't really care about graphic novels, it's not my thing. I was like, wow, this is really nice. So that's the very, two-sentence, here's what it's about. What did you think? Because I know you're a huge fan. Graphic novels.
I really liked it on a number of levels. The artwork was very well done, but the story, oh my gosh, the story was so powerful.
Yeah, and a lot was said and shown in not a lot of space and time. It's several mini, not novels, but mini stories put together. I think each of the individual sections was released individually, and this volume 1 is 7 put together.
It brought them together, yeah.
To sort of have a full story arc. So it was longer than Yes Roya, which is the other graphic novel we read this year, but it felt like a more complete story as well.
Yeah. I am a fan of sci-fi work, always have been. One of the things I tend to read are dystopian.
I know, those tend to stress
novels.
me out. I tend not to read those.
And this hit all those check marks for me.
It's a very realistic future. Quite frankly, I could see a world like that. I don't want to. I hope that stays in fiction. But you could kind of see where the I'm a feminist but porn is bad feminists get together with a religious right that thinks that the only good relationship is between a cis man and a cis woman making babies. And they take over, and in this case, they shut down and sort of capture people who they would consider sexual deviant. They take them in and they arrest them, and you're like, what the heck has happened to them? And in the story, it opens with Avery, who's basically the main character, kind of looking back at what happened, how we got to this point, and her current life, where she married a cis guy to basically fly under the radar, be safe from the party. It happened after a raid on the sex club, BDSM dungeon, brothel establishment. This really diverse group of sex workers and kinksters, and in Avery's case, she was a filmmaker and she made porn. They had built this establishment even as the party was coming to power, and it was a safe haven, and their space was raided, and Avery took off running, and the leader of the community, Jones, was arrested and taken away and presumed dead. Okay. We fast forward a few years. The party has total control of San Francisco. The place where the club had once been has actually been taken over by the party.
And made into one of their reindoctrination centers.
Yes, and that's the thing you find out. Everybody thinks that if you're taken by the party, you're probably killed or you're just sent away forever. And actually, they're running experiments on people. Avery is, even though she spent the past 2 years trying to keep herself safe and under the radar and just assimilate into a very vanilla life, she struggles with it and she thinks about her past and she misses her found family from her porn making days. She was, what was her name?
Simona Salacious.
Salacious.
Yes.
And now she goes by Avery, and she's sort of very buttoned up and trying to get a job. There are a lot of details that are disturbing and kind of come out of the sci-fi side that you were talking about. Like, you literally have to do paperwork when you have sex, and you have this monitor on your wrist. You tap a few buttons or you fill out forms. They keep something called a purity score. And it's not that you're not supposed to have sex. It's that you're supposed to have the, quote, right kind of sex.
Yes.
And the higher your purity score, the more access to privileges and things you get. The lower your score, the less access you get. The main crux of the story is that Avery and her husband sort of get found out that they're not just as vanilla as they appear to be. Her husband gets hauled off to the place that they're doing for arresting people and then basically experimenting on them. Avery runs to her former found family. They have rebuilt the dungeon, brothel, sex club space, and they have really strict rules, and none of them want to have anything to do with her because they feel abandoned by her. As you can imagine, she could pass for straight and was willing to fly under the radar, and she left them, and she left her porn making career and just went, I want to be safe above all else, which also, I understand that too. And so the story itself is about getting her husband back, finding out what happened to Jones, and then trying to tear down the party, essentially. By the end of it, this is a spoiler, but it's not. They don't accomplish that goal, but there's a volume 2 that just came out, and I'm like, I would like to purchase this, please and thank you, because I'll say this, the ending was one where I was like, I have to know what happens next.
Right.
It wasn't a cliffhanger. It ended the arc, but it ended on such a note that it was like, but that can't be the end.
Right, yeah.
What happens next? We have to find out. So we're going to have to buy that book and find out. The story part I want to get into, but I want to be in our spoiler zone because I want to talk about it. Before we get there, were there any things, minus spoilers, that stood out to you from the story, the artwork, any of those other things?
I would have to say the artwork, yes, definitely stood out to me. But what really got me with this graphic novel were the characters and the entire story. I'm going to say this, to me, this read was very reminiscent of Fahrenheit 451.
Yes. Yeah, I was thinking something similar,
the Ray Bradbury story where, books and knowledge was prohibited and, you could not. This to me was very reminiscent of that.
Yeah, except this time it's sex and pleasure.
It's sex and pleasure. It hit home in a way because of so many things that are happening in today's world. If you go against the rules of terms of service, people's account can just disappear.
Right.
With no explanation.
I feel the realness of it.
Sure.
The artwork, I don't personally care about artwork while I'm reading. I'm not a big graphic novel reader. There's nothing wrong with them. It's just not my taste. This artwork, there was something gritty about it. There was something a little chaotic about it, and that fit the story very well.
It fit the story very well, yes. Gritty is a good term. But it definitely fit the story. It fit the characters. It fit the life they had to live.
It fit the mood. Like the artwork set the mood. The story and the dialogue and the context set, depicted the mood, and then the artwork set it. You were like, yeah, this is a deep dark time, and I'm very depressed now.
Yeah. One thing that I found with this, and this is something I always look for in any book that I read. This story, it was the case. I became invested in the characters.
Yeah. They felt very real.
They felt very real. Their struggle felt real, and it was like it made me want to keep turning the page.
You keep going because you're like, what is happening next? I'm very glad we got to read the bundled volume and not the individual pieces parts. If you go on Amazon, you'll see the volume 1, and then if you go to like Tina Horn's author page on Amazon, there's all the individual parts of the series, and it's like, I'm so glad I didn't read it that way, because that I'd have been like, I need more.
Right.
I still need more.
Yes.
And let us now get into it. So we are gonna, right now, we're going into a spoiler zone. If you don't want to know all the details of how this ends and what the story is, you should stop here. I also recommend going and getting the ebook graphic novel. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on bookshop.org. Links are down below. Happy reading. But for the rest of us who need to talk about this, we've got to talk about this. So let's get into the details of what happened. So like, as we said, it opens with Avery is actually part of the opening is she's having sex, and it's not very vanilla, but it's not as kinky and as quote, wild as she might have had in previous years. Her husband, who works for the party, is like, you got to do your paperwork. We've had sex. You got to do your paperwork. That's where you get like the first mention of a purity score, and you're like, what the fuck? There's also the reminiscence of, okay, I used to have this family. I used to be this person. And in the story, you see Avery / Simone sort of fighting with, this is who I have to be right now versus who I was, and I miss who that was. She tries to go get a job with the party because they're kind of one of the biggest employers, and if you can get a job with them, you're even, quote, safer. Again, no such thing as safe.
Right.
That interview doesn't go well.
No.
She goes home, and her husband's gone. There's investigators in her apartment. And what I love is she almost goes into like superhero mode.
Yeah.
And it was stuff that she learned being into kink and bondage and how to move your body. And she actually like takes a stiletto and like gets the mean, awful investigator in the eye, and then she bolts and runs. And she goes straight back to her found family from her porn days and her kink days. And a couple of them are like, okay, we'll try to help you, but they want her to go. And the other part of them are like, you got to go. You're not even allowed in here because you're bringing danger to us.
That was kind of brought about because of the fact, towards the beginning, one of the things we see, when she was still part of that community, there was a raid.
Right. That's where Jones disappeared.
That's when Jones disappeared. But Avery managed to escape.
And she escaped for safety. She did not go back to the club to help her community.
Right.
And they're pissed, and they have every right to be.
And they have every right to be. But also, in reading the story, I think a good part of Avery's conflict with herself was due to like a form of survivor guilt.
Absolutely. And that is the struggle this is one of the struggles, I should say, that this story highlights, is that we have a right to try to keep ourselves safe, and the desire to run away and be safe is understandable. You're going to piss off anybody you've left behind, and they have every right to their anger and their hurt. The moral of the story, the point that this story was making, is you're still not safe.
Right.
You'll be safe for a little bit. One, you'll probably be unhappy if you have to pretend to be somebody you're not. And two, if you think that you can assimilate and that the larger party, the larger authority will allow it, it means you either have to kill off a part of yourself,
right,
or it's gonna blow up in your face.
Yeah,
and either way, you're gonna be
always
miserable.
Looking over your shoulder.
Right. Like it wasn't like she thrived under assimilation. She didn't have a high purity score. She didn't have a good paying job. She was miserable, and she understood she was a round peg in a square.
Yeah.
A square hole. Square peg in a round hole.
Square peg in a round hole.
She understood she didn't fit, but she was trying to fit, and she had joy with her husband and when they had sex, but outside of that, like, what was her joy? So the desire to protect oneself makes sense, and that's what a lot of people do, and we should have the right to try to protect ourselves. But the interesting thing about this story was it highlighted that in this kind of case, when you're talking about a larger authority that wants to control everybody, there is no safe.
Right.
There is no real protection. So she finds out her husband's taken. At first they're like, oh my God, Jones was taken. Clearly she's dead. Everybody believes she was dead. So then the fear was her husband would be killed. She runs back to her community. They don't want to help her. They don't want to do anything for her. They want her to go away because she's going to bring problems to them. Mm-hmm. She goes to a former client because she made porn, but she was also a sex worker. She goes to a former client who's super rich. Mm-hmm. Isn't he the one whose technology allowed the party to surveil and do all the things they were doing? Like, it was an unintended consequence, but he also knows how to use the technology, and he thrives. He's still a billionaire. He's got a high purity score. They basically leave him alone, so he has a secret sex room and dungeon and all of Avery's old porn paraphernalia.
Yes.
Like, all this, like, he's got a whole, like, shrine to it. But nobody's going to come after him because he can truly fly under the radar. And if that was not a complete parallel to real life, I don't know what is. But he's devoted to her. He wants to help her. He can work within the system to help her. Mm-hmm. Then they find out, and we're really getting into spoilers here, that's when they find out that they don't kill you, they experiment on you, and they try to reform you and change you. And we find out because Jones goes on TV with the woman who's kind of in charge of all this and is acting completely different from the person she had been, and seems to have been brainwashed, and seems to have been like, you know, I was a degenerate and my penance is I have to now help other degenerates learn and change their evil ways. And it's creepy to read it. Yeah. It's also there for me as an eternal optimist. I'm going, maybe this isn't real. Maybe she just learned how to fake it really, really well. We find out later, no. She's been turned. Her brain has been twisted. Her mind and thinking have been twisted. Can it be untwisted? We can only hope. But until that point comes, because we didn't get that in the story, she's not the same person, and their experiments have worked. Yeah. So then we find out that Avery's husband, his name is George. I think we're so bad at talking about stories. We forgot that part. His name is George. Weirdly, their conversion, their reformation, is to almost hyper expose you to the thing that turns you on. Yes. And then cause unwanted severe pain, so you associate this thing that turns you on with severe pain, and I'm sure that's a lot of it. Jones, who was, you know, Kinkster, I can't remember, did they say if she was dom, or did they, I don't know that they,
I don't think they really went into that in the
but
story.
She certainly understood how to dom. She's got George, who's submissive and loves pain and bondage and
masochist.
Oh my God, got him tied up and like doing stuff to him, and I mean, if you don't have any context, you're like, no, it's really kinky. But then you realize it's being used for torture purposes. Right. He's terrified. He clearly doesn't consent. My favorite part, though, is Jones is in the middle of trying to torture him. And he actually, again, it's sort of a superhero move. He breaks free of the bonds because he's like, I'm a masochist who learned how to deal with pain and to breathe through it because I had a good dom who taught me this stuff. And he's thinking of Avery and they're so in love. And then he can fight back. Now he's nearly naked and he's bruised and battered. And you know, but it is like a hellscape of kink. The party actually used all of the equipment they found in the club when they raided it as part of their torture and their reformation, which was just, oh my God, that was like give you chills kind of. I mean, we've just taken pervertible to its opposite and horrific meaning. What are you thinking as all of this is happening?
I was floored. I was like, I could see this happening. I could totally see this happening. You know, and again, going back to Ray Bradbury's book, Fahrenheit 451, and let's step a little further back to something more real along this lines, when they tried to ban certain music.
Sure.
You know, in the 50s.
Well, sure, they still try to ban music and books and movies now, depending on which country you happen to be in.
Sure. That's what hit home with this entire story. With this, because it showed an extreme.
Sure.
I was like,
yeah.
The
other, and there were other details that made it very realistic, even in a sad way. So one of the big plans that the party's going to have to kind of show, oh look, we took this quote, sexual deviant and reformed her, and now she's an upstanding citizen, right? They had been collecting all these sex toys and kink gear and paraphernalia and kept it, what they weren't using for their torture, up in their reformation kind of rooms. And they were going to actually bring it out and set it on fire as this really big bonfire to show people that nobody needs this. You just need to like be a man or be a woman and be with a partner and have the right kind of sex. And if you have that, then you'll be fine.
It was their version of a book burning.
Sure,
other
exactly.
than it was, kink and sex.
Right. But the thing that was most remarkable to me is not that, because we've got examples in real life and in fiction all over the place about burning the thing that offends you. The thing that was most remarkable was later in the book when we get to the point where they're about to do it, and it's the crowd and all these sex workers and kinksters, and they're trying to get the crowd to go, wait, no, we don't want this. And there were plenty of people in the crowd who are like, yeah, make this go away. This is the cause of our problems. And that felt real too, that there are people who will absolutely go along with something against their own self-interest because they think they're safe.
And that's what really hit me on such a deep level. I mean, here the purity group was exposed for what they were doing.
Towards the end, they were exposed for the torture that they were doing.
Because they were able to hack into the television network, and they exposed everything they were doing, and the people out there were still like, burn this crap, burn this,
right? Because I really think it's the perception of safety. It's the us versus the other. You were the other, you were the out group. So therefore, as long as I stay with the in group that is still clearly in power, I will be safe. Now, any one of us who's ever been on any kind of out group knows that's not true. And when as you read this, you know it's not true. And here's how you know it's not true as well. The spokesperson for the party is a woman, using all of that kind of feminist sounding language, but that's very totalitarian and very harmful to anybody who cannot fit her worldview and her view of the binary. At the same time, though, the agent who got knocked in the eye with the stiletto by Avery, he and the men around him are having conversations and rumblings of how we shouldn't have to listen to that woman. The men know what it means to be a man, and if men were in charge, and it's like further proof that you're not safe when you go under a totalitarian regime like this that decides there's one true way of something and it's the only way that everybody should have to exist. You will be on the out group. There will always be somebody who wants to have power over yet another group. And so this woman thinks she's in charge and thinks she's got power, and the men are talking to one another and going, no, we will reclaim that power. And it was yet another, and that was towards the very, very end, and it was really subtle. I'm kind of curious at how that plays out in the next volume. So in the story, though, of our cast of characters, George breaks free of his torture device.
Yes.
He runs. Through a kind of convoluted plan, the billionaire gets the group of rescuers from the club into the building. They know the building better than anyone. He makes it so they can use technology and get access to be able to carry out their plan. A young person who has been part of the club actually can get them in because that person had been experimented on.
Yes.
And that was a subplot.
A little sub-arc,
of a gay man who had been experimenting on people to find a way to turn off those feelings, because what he had found was that it hurt him more to be a gay man in this world that we now lived in, and to feel rejection or to not be able to have the love he wants to have and the life he wants to have, and he wanted a way to turn it off. And so did he experiment on himself? I don't think so. He experimented on hapless young people.
The proverbial mad scientist.
Yes.
Okay. And he had basically implanted a chip in this person that took away sexual feelings.
Yes, this kid escaped that.
Correct.
So they understood how to get through the building in secret ways, and so everybody gets in because they're going to go rescue Jones. They're going to go rescue George, right? Okay. So they come across the mad scientist who's like, oh, that chip doesn't just turn it off. I control it. And this guy actually tortured this kid with sexual pleasure, like overwhelming sexual pleasure, turned it back on and then turned it up to 11. And so disabled that kid so they couldn't help the group. Jones comes in, has a gun, is ready to kill folks. Avery's kicking ass and taking names. The other characters are kicking ass and taking names. It's like a superhero, supervillain fight.
Yeah.
What ends up being is when they take over the feed, the broadcast feed, and they expose the torture, the cruel intentions of the party, it's Avery who goes on as the spokesperson to give everybody time to get away, including George. Like, everybody's got to get away. They're trying to open the world's eyes. All we see are the people whose eyes weren't opened. What we don't see is who went, oh my God, this is awful. Like, we don't see what happens from that. But in the meantime, the agents are finding them and tracking them, whatever. Yeah. And so the end, they think Jones dies. They actually used an electrified cage that used to be part of the BDSM club to shock her and knock her out. My hopeful self is like, maybe that'll like re-scramble her brain and she'll wake up and be herself. Do a reset. Right, hard reboot. But they think she's died. For all we know, she's died. Avery tells everybody, including George, run, go, spread the word, do what you can. I will stay here and let them catch me so you can get away. And that's what happens. And we end with the punishment is she now works for the party. And her job is to spend all her time on the internet making sex content disappear off the internet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yes, she has saved the people she cares about. She's certainly no longer safe in the way she had tried to be at the beginning. She thinks she's killed people. Maybe she has. She doesn't think she'll ever see them again. And she's now in this drudgery job, literally deleting a thing she loves. And it is the saddest thing.
Yeah.
I was like, yay, they got away. George is going to be fine. Everybody's going, yay. And then you see her. And you're like, and thankfully it's volume 1. There's volume 2. I'm hopeful for what volume 2 brings, but whew.
And yeah, while the ending was kind of jaw dropping, it does. It makes me want to read the next volume even more, because in my mind I'm like, it can't end this way. It can't.
In the realistic part of me that has seen a lot of realistic things in this quote fantasy of the future, I'm like, but it totally could. I could totally see that. Because at the same time, that is when you're seeing that they've kicked the woman out of power because that was bad publicity, not bad actions. Nobody's going, oh, well, she shouldn't have done it. She shouldn't have been the spokesperson who got caught doing it.
Yeah.
The men are talking about, these agents are talking about, taking over and real men and the toxic masculinity bullshit of the patriarchy that we've already got. And all that's happening. You don't quite know, did Jones die? We think so.
Yeah.
But we don't know. I've read enough fiction to know that twists are a thing.
True.
The quote, good guys have escaped minus Avery. It's just...
Yeah.
And I go back to, and this has been a very chaotic telling and discussion of this. Part of it is because there was a lot going on all at once.
There was.
There's a lot of sort of jumps from this time period to that time period, this memory to that memory, this event to that event. There's actually, for it to be as some people say, a comic book, it's a graphic novel. For it to be that, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of subtext and there's a lot of like realizations. And if you're paying attention to the little details, that's when you catch the ain't nobody safe, because now they're going to go after women shouldn't be in charge. You can see that coming. And the nuance of the party was exposed for torturing people, and absolutely there were still some people who were like, burn it all to the ground. They deserved it. They're deviants. Because you know what? Those people still exist now. So how would they not exist in this regime when they have been able to label themselves as good and right based on a purity score, based on doing the right kinds of things, having the right kinds of sex? That it's all there and it's all happening at once. And it's an action-packed story. And I am not a person who's like, sign me up for graphic novels, but I am like, sign me up for more of this.
Yeah.
This was so good. So good. So good. And we didn't even get into the details of the little things you got to see about how the club was run and how they talked to people and who did what. And oh, there's so much there. I'm so glad we ended on this one.
I enjoyed it. I loved every minute of it, both the artwork, the story, and the characters.
Highly recommend.
Yeah, definitely. You know, it's well worth the read. Well worth the read.
There's parts of it that it's depressing because if you try to be a person who has a sex life on the internet, you don't even have to be a professional, you don't have to be a content creator, you can literally just be a person who's like, I would like to talk about my sex life on the internet. You have come across some of this stuff. You've been shadow banned, your account's been terminated, you can't be found on anything, posts have been deleted, trolls come out of the woodworks to tell you how wrong you are. You can read on almost any news outlet somebody with an opinion on what you do between consenting adults behind closed doors is somehow their business. Like we, as kinksters, you don't even have to go deeper than that. You could just be a kinkster, just be an adult with a sex life on the internet. And in some ways, you've probably faced some level of this. I can only imagine what sex workers go through. Like I read about it and I hear about it, but I can, this story kind of gives you that glimpse a little bit, and it truly, from our limited perspective, doesn't feel that far off. I could see it happening. It's scary. You clearly wouldn't want it to happen. I think it could be stopped, but part of that is the laws that come about and the rules that are made on platforms are made because most people want to keep their sex life private, their kink life private. You don't use your real name so you don't get found out, which means that the vast majority of us who are using the internet for sex in some way will not and do not feel safe standing up and calling lawmakers to say you can't pass this law. You're infringing on my rights. And so they only hear from a very small minority of people who think all sex outside of marriage, outside of cis men, cis women is bad. And so it seems like, we're doing the right thing because these people say we're doing the right thing when tens, hundreds of millions of us are all going
feel differently.
You're fucking with my sex life here. Like, what are you doing? So that's the scary thing. That's why I can see it happening. Yeah. It would take the masses coming together and going, I'm not ashamed of my sex life. Consequences be damned. You can't do that. I need this. You can't take this away from me. But we don't do that for lots of really good reasons. And so therefore, companies get away with this, legal institutions get away with this, it gets to happen. So I'm not a conspiracy theorist on anything, and I'm reading that going, I can see that happening. Yeah. Totally see that happening. That's our long ramble on this month's book, Safe Sex Volume 1 Protection. Highly recommend, we've already said. This is the final installation of Kinky Book Club 2021. We do not think there will be a 2022 version. It's not because we did not enjoy reading these books or having these discussions. It's because we didn't love having to do it on a deadline. I have recently discovered a term for myself that I didn't know existed until the internet, and that is mood reader. I read what I'm in the mood for. I actually struggle with reading things I, quote, have to read or I assign myself to read. It makes it a little less enjoyable. I procrastinate, then I'm stressed reading, and I love to read, and who wants to be stressed while you're reading? I'm not in college anymore. I should not have to live that life. So I think what we're going to do is we have gotten a lot of suggestions for books since we started Kinky Book Club. I think what we'll do is we will continue to read kink-based books, and we will continue to have discussions, but they will not come on a regular basis. They might be worked into a podcast episode. I've already got one book I would really like to do a podcast episode about. They'll be in reviews. We'll sometimes just do a video on a book we read and go from there, but we don't want that to discourage anybody from reading the books that we recommended, the books we will read in the future, the books you find. Also, feel free to go, I read this book. Have you read this book? And maybe we haven't, and maybe we will.
True.
So Kinky Book Club has been fun, but we're going to put the year that is 2021 to bed, and we're going to put the official idea of Kinky Book Club to bed for now.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows what'll happen in the future? And so that's it for us. Also, this is our last official video of 2021 in general.
True.
So the next time you see us, it'll be in a new year. Unless you're watching the archive and then you're time traveling, and I don't know what year we'll be in, but you get it. Okay, so that's it for us this time. If you enjoyed this video, we love a thumbs up. If you like it enough to come back for more, and normally we talk about kink, relationships, and education and stuff like that, please consider subscribing.
And once you do that, ring that notification bell to get updated new content.
Just do what Daddy says. And if you enjoy what we do here, want to help us do even more of it, and get access to perks and content you can't get anywhere else, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/KaylaLords. Bye.